Today what I'm going to be talking about is a historical perspective on the relationship between the Nusklium, or the Sklallam people, and the Western Red Cedar tree. As I've mentioned multiple times in previous presentations, the Sklallam have a very deep and rich history in connection with the Western Red Cedar, and it was called the Tree of Life for Coast Salish peoples for a very important reason. It provided almost all of the materials that Coast Salish peoples used in their day-to-day life. And so today what I'm going to provide is sort of a historic reference for where those cultural ties began, and then how we see those represented ethnographically and in the tribe's collections and culture today. Some of the images on your screen, we'll dive more into those as we go, but the image on the right side of your screen is a picture of tribal elder Kathy McGregor processing cedar bark when we went out on one of our bark gathering trips to Indian Island a couple years ago. This presentation was originally given as a part of a presentation series for the Dungeness River Center, which is why you see their logo on the cover screen. So where did Western Red Cedars come from? We know from looking into the pollen record that going back roughly 10,000 years, Western Red Cedar was on the west coast, but it was probably restricted to a very coastal habitat, riparian corridors along rivers, areas where it had lots of fresh water. At that time, so let's say starting roughly 8 to 9,000 years ago, and then stretching back to the end of the last ice age at roughly 14 to 15,000 years ago. Following the end of the last ice age, there is a period of warming and drying in Western Washington. And the landscape of Western Washington at that time was much more reminiscent of what we see in Eastern Washington today. It was a much more open park-like landscape. You had a lot of Gary oak groves, white pine, lodgepole pine, basically drier ecology. This is when the squim cactus and all of our local dry prairie plants reached our little corner of the world. And actually the prairies that we see in the rain shadow of the Olympic Mountains, then those prairies going down into South Puget Sound, those prairies are the last remnant of that ecology of Western Washington 10,000 years ago that was much more arid and dry. Those prairies hung on because the tribal peoples living in the areas of those prairies kept burning them repeatedly, which kept the western hemlock, red cedar, Douglas fir forest from closing in. However, in the rest of Western Washington, where people weren't actively burning the landscape, those forests closed in. We see this in the pollen record. So by about 6,000 years ago, the forest had closed in over Western Washington, reminiscent to what it is today. So you have a pretty closed canopy, dark forest floor. The species in the forest are predominantly dominated by conifers, Western red cedar, Douglas fir, Western hemlock, Sitka spruce, and some others. So really, red cedar wasn't prevalent enough to be of huge technological use to the Coast Salish until that time 6,000 years ago. It's worth noting that culturally, up until that point, the Native Americans on the Western Washington landscape were actually relatively nomadic, living in small groups and hunting large land mammals. Elk, deer, bison, caribou, all of those animals, which a lot of them were eventually extirpated off the landscape, but folks were moving. They're relatively nomadic. They were moving a lot over the landscape, hunting large mammals. As the forest closed in over Western Washington between 6,000 and 7,000 years ago, it made it much harder to hunt animals on that landscape. So humans hunting on land were really much more restricted to those open prairies that I mentioned earlier. And so we see this transition represented culturally in the archaeology and the technologies that people were using, shifting from land mammal hunting to marine foraging, fishing for salmon, and hunting marine mammals like dolphins, orcas, seals, this sort of thing. We also see an increased usage of bone tools Prior to this, most, well, not most, but a lot of tools were actually made out of stone, either flaked out of stone or ground slate, ground stone points. Starting 3,000 to 6,000 years ago, we start seeing a much higher usage of bone tools, and especially tools made out of antler, elk and deer antler. Then by the time we get to what archaeologists call the early maritime period, which is roughly 3,000 to 1,000 years before present, we start seeing really highly developed bone and woodworking technology. So basically what you're seeing is in that 5,000 year period from 6,000 years before present to roughly 1,000 years before present, that was when the slalom, and on a broader scale, the Coast Salish, really spent 5,000 years developing these amazing technologies for working with red cedar in terms of not just timber and wood, but also bark, roots, fibers. Almost every element of the tree was used. By the time you get to what modern archaeologists and ethnographers call the prehistoric Northwest Coast pattern, which is sort of the cultural pattern that was in place when non-natives arrived here in Western Washington 200 to 300 years ago. You have almost no chipstone tools left. Basically, the last chipstone tools were kind of big scrapers and choppers. When you needed something really heavy and with a sharp edge to chop through something, you're going to use a stone tool. But other than that, you're relying almost entirely on bone tools, and you have a really highly sophisticated use of cedar bark, roots, and wood. And we're going to dive more into each of those today. So just going over a couple of the woodworking tools that I just mentioned. One of the great things about Western Red Cedar, and one of the reasons why it was so important for the Coast Salish people, was the fact that it actually splits straight down the grain. So if you have a cedar log and you drive an elk antler wedge into it, which is the artifact you can see on the top left corner of your screen, or in the bottom left corner, what they would do is, using fire and a chipstone blade, they would hack off the end of an elk antler or a deer antler tine. And then you can see one end of that tine has actually been ground down with a piece of sandstone into a nice polished wedge. And you can take this antler wedge and you can drive it into a red cedar log using the nipple maul in the bottom right corner of the screen, that stone tool that you can see. You would hold that in your hand, and that was essentially your handheld hammer that you would drive the antler wedge into cedar. And with cedar splitting straight down the grain, you don't need sophisticated metal tools to mill cedar into straight timbers. You don't need it. You don't need metal tools to carve elaborate things. Basically, what you need is just stone tools to split it into your nice, your beams that you would use for putting together a longhouse. Or you would use adze blades, like the example in the middle of the screen there, you can see with the yellow ruler next to it. Adze blades made of nephrite, which is a type of jade that can be found in a vein that runs north-south through the Cascade Mountains up into British Columbia and south to Skagit country. So nephrite, you would take that, you would grind it down in the similar way to how they would do elk antler wedges. You can grind nephrite down into a really nice razor-sharp adze blade. That would in turn be hafted onto a yew handle, which was actually made from a piece of yew wood that comes from the crook of the tree where a branch is. So right where that branch comes out of a yew tree, you've got an extremely strong piece of wood right there at the bottom brace of that branch. So they would actually use that. They would haft on this adze blade using elk sinew and fir pitch from Douglas fir. And that's actually what you would use to carve out like a canoe, carve a house post, do your more elaborate carving and fine work. And you can see the image sort of in the background in this slide is an image from the House of Myths Jamestown carving shed today, showing you the steel adze blades that they use which are literally just steel versions of the stone adze blades, which they used in pre-contact times. So what's done today in the tribal carving sheds is literally the same traditions, just using more modern technology, more modern tools to accomplish that. The adze blade that's in the center image was actually found in excavations we did here at the Jamestown Tribe's Veterans Memorial, just behind the Jamestown Administration Building here in Blinn. As we were constructing the memorial in 2018, we found a disturbed shell midden, which we excavated, and actually in one of our very first excavation units found this beautiful adze blade just under 3 or 4 centimeters of soil, which is a really great find for us. So just to give you an idea from a cultural perspective, just some of the multitude of uses of Western Red Cedar. I'm not going to go through all of these terms, and there are actually many, many more terms in the Squalum Dictionary for pieces of red cedar, technologies using red cedar, tools using red cedar. But you have dozens of words representing the many, many different uses of this tree. The image on the right side, you can see during the cedar bark gathering process, and this is something that the tribe's traditional foods and culture program today organizes annual cedar bark gathering trips for tribal citizens to go out either on tribal reservation lands, or we'll partner up with a state or federal agency like the Navy at Indian Island and go out there and get some cedar strips. Traditionally, what you do is harvest a strip of bark off of the tree roughly the width of your outstretched hand. And the reason you do that is the intention is not to kill the tree. And if you only take one strip from a red cedar tree and you leave it as is, it'll actually naturally heal itself, and the tree can continue to live for hundreds or thousands of years after you peel that bark. And there's more traditions around peeling the bark, so please don't go out and start hacking at bark on a cedar tree, because if you don't know how to do it correctly, and even more importantly, if you're not doing it at the right time of year, you're not going to get the bark that you need, and you're actually going to do a lot of unnecessary damage to the tree. However, when you do get that strip off of the tree, the first step is what you can see happening in the image on the right side of your screen, which is you actually split the bark between your legs. You split off the very soft, fibrous outer bark from the stronger, tougher inner bark. That tough inner bark is actually what you'll take that home, you'll hang it up, and you'll let it cure for a couple months to a year. Then you'll take that down, you'll soak it in a bucket of water, and then you'll process it in strips anywhere from a 1/16 to a quarter to a 1/2 inch to an inch wide, depending on what you're making and what size cedar strips you use. And those cedar strips are what you would then use to weave a basket, a mat, a hat, something like that. The fibrous outer bark, which you can see piled behind this individual, today that's usually left behind at the base of the tree. We try to return as much of the material to the tree as possible that we're not going to use. We don't want it to go to waste. However, traditionally in the past, that very soft, fibrous outer bark would have also been taken. If you rub it between your hands, it actually starts to mat out and turn into this big, fibrous mat, almost like a coconut husk fiber. And you would have big piles of that around the longhouse. And that's what you would use for napkins during meals. It's what you would use for diapers for babies. When you're wrapping them up in their cradle board, you would tuck in a bunch of that cedar bark fiber around them inside the cradle board wrapping. It was used as towel. It was also used as a fire starter. So again, every part of that tree, starting with the very outer loose fibrous bark moving into the inner bark, would have been used for some purpose in the day-to-day life of the squalum. Another important use of cedar was actually using the cedar limbs and the long, skinny boughs that come down off of a cedar branch. Those would have been cut off, and they're very, very pliable, especially if you soak them in water. and you can actually braid those to create a very, very strong rope. So they would actually create extensive ropes made out of these cedar limbs. They would also dig up, cut, and use cedar roots, usually during basket weaving activities, but they did have other uses as well. These are some historical images from the Olympic Peninsula. The image on the far right side is actually Captain Charles Hall, Jamestown tribal ancestor, standing in one. He was the last traditional canoe carver at the Jamestown tribe, and he's standing in one of the last canoes that he carved down there on Jamestown Beach. The image in the top right side of your screen is actually from Nia Bay, but I do believe it is one of Charles Hall's sons who moved to Nia Bay and continued to carve canoes in the family tradition. I haven't confirmed his identity, but I believe it's one of the Hall brothers. And then the image in the bottom middle part of your screen is actually from Hollywood Beach in Port Angeles. Prior to the development of the waterfront, in this area that you see now in this image with the canoes put up on the beach is actually now mostly under a couple feet of fill. As the Squalum were forced off of their traditional village sites at Cheweetson, at Ennis, moving east over to Jamestown, what happened was those tribal folks would usually end up on the periphery of the non-native settlement like Port Angeles, living in tent encampments like this with their canoes pulled up, and they would use those canoes for the biggest thing was actually transporting trade goods from Port Angeles, from Sequim and other areas on the North Olympic Peninsula over to Victoria on Vancouver Island, and then over to Port Townsend and Seattle and the other growing cities around the Salish Sea at that time. And you can see back in the day, every single Squalum family had to have a canoe, much the way that every family today in our society needs a car to get around to go to work, conduct their day-to-day business, and basically live their life. Back in the day, a canoe was the way that you did that. And so in reference to the Jamestown tribe specifically, if you look at the layout of the original Jamestown settlement, the lots were long perpendicular lots, and the reason for that was so that each family could have a little sliver of beach frontage to pull up their canoe so that they could continue their traditional lifestyle. These really awesome pictures are from the late 1980s, early 1990s, with the paddle to Bella Bella and the reignition of the tribal canoe tradition centered around the tribal canoe journey, the initial paddle to Seattle, then the paddle to canoe journey to Bella Bella, and the annual canoe journeys after that. The Jamestown Squalum tribe actually found an old growth Western Red Cedar log. They went out there, the tribe actually went out and conducted a blessing ceremony on the tree before it was cut. It was harvested, it was brought back to the what's now the former carving shed here on our Blinn campus. And you can see here photos of tribal citizens and then non-tribal assistants actually carving the Lacanum canoe out of a Western Red Cedar log. So there's now two Jamestown canoes, the Yawitsa, or little sister, and then the Lacanum, and one or both of those canoes have been taken on the annual canoe journeys. You can see an image in the bottom right side of your screen from a canoe landing at Hollywood Beach from a couple years ago of the canoe being carved in this picture. So another very important use of Western Red Cedar was obviously the construction of the Longhouse and then the village in a broader sense. This description is actually a description from Erna Gunther, relayed to Erna Gunther by tribal ancestors of what the village and specifically the Potlatch house at Chiquing, which was the Squalum village at Washington Harbor on Sequim Bay, looked like. And it was huge. Every significant Squalum village would have had at least one potlatch house where potlatches were held, and then usually the chief or a significant family of noble lineage would inhabit these large homes. The one at Washington Harbor was roughly 15 by 200 feet in dimension. So you can get a sense of the absolute massive scale of these buildings. Another famous, very large longhouse was Old Man House over at Suquamish and Agate Pass. And you can look up accounts of that one. There's actually some photos of the house posts still standing from that longhouse. And it really helps give you a sense of the scale of just the house posts used to hold up these buildings themselves were massive old-growth Western Red Cedar logs that were supporting thousands of pounds of timber. And the way that these were held together was without any metal nails. So what they would do is actually bore holes in the cedar planks, and then you would use cordage made out of cedar to actually tie those cedar planks to the support post. Over time, you would eventually replace that cordage as needed. But those would hold your planks up to the support post, and then overhead, they would just lay the planks horizontally over the roof beams, and then over hearth areas where you had a cooking hearth. Within a potlatch house, you would actually have quite a few different hearth areas for different families to be cooking. You would open up gaps in those timbers so that smoke could pass out through the roof. These buildings were very flexible in a sense that if something happened, if the village was attacked, if there was an outbreak of disease, if for whatever reason the village needed to be moved, you could essentially disassemble an entire longhouse in a day or two by untying all of the cords, piling up all of your timbers, putting those on your canoe, and then paddling over to the next village site and reassembling your longhouse. So, it was a very useful way to construct buildings in that it gives you a lot of flexibility. During the summer months, what would happen is these longhouses were the predominant habitation structures within the winter villages, where the Squam would go back from roughly the months of October through April. They would live there during the winter and rainy seasons, and that's when they would conduct their spiritual and ceremonial side of life. And then starting in spring, as things warm back up, plants start growing, animals start coming out of their holes, folks would start leaving the winter village sites and going back out to their summer camps, their clam harvesting locations, plant harvesting locations, salmon streams, what name you. As they would depart to those more temporary sites, they would arrive there and they would set up smaller cedar posts, usually just a few inches in diameter, and then over those you would drape tule mats or mats woven out of cedar. And you would hang those mats depending on what direction prevailing wind was coming from, if it was raining, if the sun was shining from a certain direction. So again, having a lot of flexibility with these materials in terms of setting up the structures in a way that really adapts to the environment, adapts to the landscape, and gives you the best line of sight and the best environmental conditions for whatever you're trying to do there. Oh, and one final note on this slide. You can see in this image that I recreated, I tried to do a little Microsoft Paint work in there with the red and black. The house posts on Squam longhouses were traditionally decorated according to what the chief or the noble person from that family had decided. In specific reference to the longhouse at Shtiquing, the last chief there, Zalkanim, carved posts set about 10 feet apart that were 6 inches diameter and painted with alternating strips of red and white. And then at the top of each of those posts was actually carved a figure of a bird with outstretched wings. And he carved those figures because his guardian spirit, the sun, instructed him to. We also have really great accounts of the Squam longhouse at the village on Beecher Bay over on Vancouver Island. The chief there actually created this really beautiful, elaborate sheet on the outside of his longhouse with a thunderbird with outstretched wings on it. And he did that on the roof with the wings were represented by holes drilled out in the roof, so that when you were inside the longhouse and looked up at the roof, the light shining through gave you this wonderful image of a thunderbird with outstretched wings. Here's some images of slalom longhouses. So the watercolor on the right side of the screen was actually done by James Swan in 1859, showing a potlatch held by Chichmahan, or Chief Chetzemoka, the Duke of York, who was the hereditary chief of the Slalom people at the time of the treaty signing in the 1850s. Chichmahan's family was originally from Stetiflum, a village just east of the Dungeness River. And then in the 1850s, Chichmahan moved his family and many of those families over to Katai, the village site that is where Port Townsend is now. This image is showing you the inside of his longhouse during a potlatch. And again, you can see very significant structure, over 100 feet long, roof over 15, 20 feet high, fitting hundreds of people inside it with ample room to spare. You can see different activity areas, dances happening in the middle. The woman in the blue dress that's facing facing Swan as he painted this is actually Chilil, who is Chichmahan's second and younger wife, as she distributes iktas, or gifts, at the potlatch. And then you can see around the edge of the longhouse dozens of people sitting on benches. So around all of the longhouses would be these benches, roughly about 12 inches off the ground and roughly 2 to 3 feet deep. During the daytime, these were benches for sitting, like what you see here, and then at nighttime, these were beds, and you would have piles of furs and blankets on those during the winter, and then in summer months, you need less of that. The images on the left side of your screen, I'm not sure where the longhouse on the bottom left image is from. I think it's from Dungeness, but I'm not 100% sure on that. The images in the top left corner of your screen were actually the last two longhouses at Shchequing, and these were actually constructed out on Travis Spit, so out on the spit across from the village in the sketch that we just saw. What happened was, historically, that village was settled by non-natives, and some of the Squam folks who lived in the village of Shchequing simply moved over to the end of the spit, where they constructed these longhouses. Much as I just previously described, they essentially just took the longhouses apart, put them on the canoes, paddled them over the spit, and then you can see here reconstructed them in the traditional style. This amazing painting by Paul Kane shows the interior of a Clallam winter lodge over on Vancouver Island. You can see the gaps in the roof that I mentioned, kind of centered over hearth areas where the smoke would escape. You can see also around the edge of the building, along the rafters, elevated platforms on poles where you've got piles of furs. Those would have been primarily elk hides, but many other animal furs piled up for storage and for trade. This is also where you would store your baskets and Bentwood boxes full of preserved food goods for winter, like your dried berries, your smoked salmon, those sort of things, your cooked camas. You can see the partitions within the longhouse. So, within a given longhouse, you would have had an extended family, including grandparents, many aunts and uncles, cousins, second cousins, and then each of those nuclear families would have its own sort of apartment set aside by these partitions. They would be their living area, and then you can see there's a central hearth that represents more of a communal gathering area in the center of the longhouse. One of my favorite parts about this image is you can also see the little fuzzy white wool dogs that were traditionally kept by Squam women and used for taking the wool and then actually weaving beautiful blankets out of them, dog hair blankets. This is an example of just some of the different baskets that were woven using Western Red Cedar. The top left, beautiful contemporary example of Western Red Cedar gathering basket with a trump line made by Jamestown Slalom tribal elder Kathy McGregor, who can weave just about anything, and her work is amazing. The trump line that you see here was actually used. That strap or trump line actually goes around the forehead, so when women were out gathering berries or other plant goods, they would hang this basket behind their back, wrap the trump line over their forehead, and then as you're walking and gathering, you can drop the items in the basket behind you, keep moving, keep walking, keep harvesting. The image in the top center of the screen is a clam gathering basket donated from the Adams family of the Jamestown Slalom tribe. So you can see with the clam basket, much rougher, looser weave, and that very open, loose weave is done intentionally so that as you're out on the tidal flats digging your clams, you throw them in that basket, the water eventually drains out of those clams so that by the time you have to pick up the basket and carry it back to the village site, it weighs a lot less. You can actually take that basket with all of your dirty, muddy, sandy clams in it, go find a nice bucket of water or spot of deep water and just dip the basket a couple times and wash your clams like that, and then let it drain out and take your clams and cook them. The image sort of in the bottom center of your screen is an amazing basket fragment that was found under a retreating ice sheet up on Obstruction Ridge between Blue Mountain and Hurricane Ridge in Olympic National Park. This was roughly 10 years ago. As the ice sheet retreated, this basket fragment was found. The Olympic National Park archaeologists were able to salvage it, conduct some conservation to preserve it permanently, and you can actually see a replica of this basket fragment on exhibit up at the Olympic National Park Hurricane Ridge Visitor Center. They did some radiocarbon dating, and this basket fragment is actually 2,900 years old. And what's amazing is the weaves, the weaving techniques that are used in this basket are almost identical to some of the baskets that are still made today and were made into the historic era. So there's been a lot of really cool work done with excavating basket fragments from this one's the exception in coming from a retreating ice sheet. Usually we find them at what are called wet sites, which are archaeological sites that are permanently or almost permanently inundated with water. So more of a boggy situation. There was a wet site excavated out at the Hoko River, out on the northwest corner of the Olympic Peninsula, where basket fragments were found. What's great in that anaerobic environment without oxygen, those natural fibers like cedar are preserved so they can be excavated. And then there's experts like Ed Carrier, who's a tribal elder over at the Squamish tribe, has made an entire career out of examining these archaeological basket fragments and then recreating those weaves and creating baskets using those weaves that we can date back to thousands of years ago, and then actually doing analysis and looking at the similarities and differences between those weaving patterns and technologies used thousands of years ago compared to those used just 100 and 200 years ago. And has got some really interesting insights in sort of the development of weaving technologies in the Pacific Northwest over the last 5,000 years. The image on the right side of your screen is a basket in the Jamestown tribal collections that was woven by Mrs. Sam Ulmer, who was actually Lower Elwha Clallam back in the 1940s. And this is sort of a kind of a typical smaller basket that you would have had around the house just to hold day-to-day goods. So a few notes on woodworking, just to kind of cover the whole gamut of possible uses, and we're not going to cover everything today. You could do 1,000 presentations on all the uses of cedar. One of my favorite ones is actually cedar bark balers, which were used obviously when you're out paddling your canoe across the Strait of Juan de Fuca. It can get windy, it can get cold, it can get rainy, it can get choppy. Water's going to end up in the canoe. You're going to do some baling. There's a really cool technique that tribal elders still use today where you can essentially cut it's a roughly rectangular or squarish block of bark off of the side of a Western Red Cedar tree, and then you simply wrap that up and then attach a handle, and the bark itself is a watertight, water-sealed material. So when you wrap it up into that cylindrical shape and you add a handle to it, you've got this wonderful bailer that you can keep in the bottom of your canoe, and anytime water starts getting in, that was what the kids had to do while everybody else was paddling. The image just to the right of that, a cedar bentwood box. Bentwood boxes were incredibly important, not just for general storage of goods, but especially for storage and preservation of foodstuffs for late winter. One of the reasons why you had such wonderful cultural and technological development throughout the Pacific Northwest tribes was because they were so exceptionally skilled at preserving foodstuffs for winter. So Coast Salish and in broader sense Pacific Northwest tribes were not agricultural societies in the most typical sense of the word, but they had these amazing technological systems set up so that they could spend our very productive summer months out on the landscape gathering all of the wonderful resources that Mother Nature provided, and then simply preserving those for the winter months when there aren't as many resources available. And like I said earlier, during those winter months, that's when you return to the village, and that's when you participate in the ceremonial cycle and sort of the communal, spiritual, and social side of things. With bentwood boxes, what you would do is actually cut split a timber board off of red cedar, and then you would kerf that. You would cut 4 kerfs into that board, and then you would steam it and then bend at each of those kerfs, and then using wooden dowels or pegs, you connect those in one corner, add a panel to the bottom, and they would usually, you could use pitch or another type of sealant to sort of seal where you did have creases on that bentwood box. And then what you've got there is a watertight box. You can use that for carrying water. It was also used for heating water, so you could put water in a bentwood box and then start dropping red hot stones in it until it came to a boil. You would also use bentwood boxes to store the food for late winter, especially things like berries. What would have been done is mixing a lot of salmon berries, salal berries, with something like seal grease, bear grease, another type of animal grease is a preservative. The berries would be dried, they would be stuffed into a bentwood box, and then a layer of that grease would be coated over the top of the berries. You reopen that box in late winter and you've got wonderful sweet berries for eating, a nice rich source of vitamin C and other nutrients. And then bentwood boxes were also great for being able to store goods, especially if you had to pack them on a canoe to, say, take some valuable goods to a potlatch at another village site. Bentwood box was a great tool to have to get things from one village to another village on a canoe and keep them dry. On the bottom left image in your screen, you can see a spindle whorl and a needle. The spindle whorls were actually usually carved. They were carved from red cedar, and then often, and I believe this specific example was actually carved out of whalebone, a whale vertebrae, and then the needle itself is cedar. And these were used for weaving the dog wool blankets that I mentioned earlier, amongst other things. The image in the center of your screen is actually a example of a sort of smaller traditional house post carving that would have been done in the early 20th century by a Squalum carver for the tourist trade. You can see that it's actually done with the traditional black Tamenoist face paint, and he's holding a salmon in his arms. And then the image on the right side of your screen are the Dance Plaza house posts that you can usually see at the Dance Plaza here on our Blinn campus, administrative campus for the Jamestown Tribe. However, those poles are currently at our carving shed being refurbished. So if you went out there right now, all you're going to see are the mounts, but hoping to have those back up. Next year or the year after, we've got to do some construction work around the Dance Plaza, and then those poles will be going back up. They actually tell the story of the Wolf Mother from the village of Chiquing at Washington Harbor, which you can find elaborated on in the totem book, which is available at the tribal library. So finally, what I wanted to talk about was sort of where this fits into what the Jamestown Tribal Historic Preservation Office does today in terms of cultural resource management. Part of our day-to-day work and the field work that we engaged in identifying and preserving cultural and historic resources is doing field surveys to identify those resources. And one of the very most prevalent cultural resources that we have on our landscape are culturally modified trees. A culturally modified tree is really any tree that was modified historically by humans for any purpose. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to be talking more specifically to trees modified by the Squalum and their ancestors. It can be something as simple as the springboard notch that you see started in the top left image on your screen, that the start of the springboard notch, and then actually in the bottom, very bottom right, you can see an old growth cedar stump with a springboard notch, and then the springboard itself is actually still leaning up against that stump. So those are much more recent historic examples of culturally modified trees done with modern or more modern logging techniques. However, if you can see the image here with somebody actually actively stripping a cedar bark off of the tree like I described earlier. So as I mentioned, you traditionally only harvest that one strip about the width of your hand off of the tree, and then you leave the tree to heal. What happens is it forms what archaeologists call a cat's ear. If you look at the image on the far right side of your screen, you can see one of these cat's ears on a very old Western Red Cedar that has been healing over. This one, it was probably stripped somewhere around 100 years ago. Maybe a little bit older than that. And then you can see actually at the bottom of that cat's ear some fire damage. So you'll strip the bark, it creates a cat's ear, the tree naturally heals itself. However, as part of our natural wildfire cycle, when there are forest fires on the landscape, they will hit the tree at that scar, and then you'll see that evidence of fire left on those tree scars. Another example on the far left side of the screen, you can see what's called a candelabra tree. So these were usually used for marking trail systems and other sites, and they have a variety of cultural purposes that I won't dive into too much. But the way that these were made was essentially by snapping off the main or splitting off the main trunk of the red cedar or large adjacent limbs, causes it to send up these vertical buttresses. You would do that a couple times, and so you would actually create, you can see here in this image, like a tiered buttress, a system of tiered buttresses going up that Western Red Cedar. They look very distinctive in the forest. They're very different from what you'll see. You can have these buttresses form naturally. What you won't have is a series of these buttresses forming naturally in an old growth tree that's close to a site of cultural significance. The image just to the right of that, where you can see 3 red cedars in a line, it's kind of hard to see in this image, but what you have there are three pairs of Western red cedars that have been wrapped around each other very tightly, almost like in a pattern reminiscent of a peppermint cane, like at Christmas time. Again, you will have cedars naturally wrap around each other in the forest. However, in this specific location, we've actually got a series of 4 of them that are in a direct linear alignment, and they're in conjunction with a series of cedar bark stripped and other culturally modified trees, and they're marking the intersection of a trail system. This is in the woods, a ways south of Anderson Lake Park on the Quimper Peninsula. But essentially, this would have been done to mark the intersection of a traditional trail system that went through the forest and is just designating an important area. So this kind of gives you an idea of, culturally modified trees can represent everything from trees simply being modified for the harvesting of a specific resource, fiber, root, bark, timber of that tree, or actually modifying the tree to actually play an active role on the landscape in terms of marking something, representing something, making sure that other folks moving across the landscape are aware of where they are. Because you have to remember back in the day when there weren't roads and that forest was very closed in, these culturally modified trees were really they were sort of the billboards of the old growth forest. And so this is how folks would navigate those old growth forests going back to 5,000-6,000 years ago.